Hello, everyone. It is my honor to welcome you all to the second day of the 2021 American Express Leadership Academy, the Global Summit. Thank you to all of you who joined us yesterday, and a reminder again to join us tomorrow. And thank you, of course, for joining us today. I also extend a special greeting to our American Express Leadership Academy Alumni Network. This alumni gathering is an opportunity to bring together this global community of social sector leaders who have participated in a leadership academy. This year, we are engaging in our first virtual summit and our largest gathering today. Our daily keynote speaker sessions are a way to bring the message of the summit to a larger audience. Now, the theme for this year's summit is Our Path Forward, Lead, Listen, Flourish. Today, of course, we will focus on the topic of listen as we engage in a conversation, continuing the journey that Trabian and Stacey were on yesterday, which I'm sure those of you who were on it found it utterly inspiring. I certainly did. So my name is Adirupa Sengupta. I'm the Group Chief Executive of Common Purpose, which is an international leadership development, not-for-profit. I'm based out of London, but with some very strong roots in Asia. I was born and brought up in India, and most recently, I had a pretty long stint in Singapore and Southeast Asia. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Lina Chandra, who's the founder and trustee of Rachel House, and by Dr. Monica Keretts-Makau, who's the academic director, Africa, for the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Very much fitting with our global community. Lina joins us from Singapore in Southeast Asia, and Monica joins us from Kenya in the African continent. And there's me in the UK. Now, before we start our conversation, we also want to absolutely listen to all your comments and questions. So please send them in either of the two ways. If you're joining us via the Summit platform, type your question in the Q&A section of the chat box. And if you're joining us on social media, then type your question in the comment section on Facebook or use the hashtag @AmexLeads. We really, really look forward to hearing from all of you. Now, on that note, let's begin. Lina and Monica, thank you very much, of course, for joining us today. I, of course, have the deep privilege of knowing Lina very well over the years, and Monica too. And I can't tell you how excited I am to host this with them. We at Common Purpose are incredibly proud and grateful to American Express for that long-standing partnership that we've had with them over the years and hopefully into the future. That partnership allows us to drive our purpose, which is to help leaders cross boundaries and solve complex problems and have a deep, deep social impact. And I know both Lina and Monica resonate with that massively. So Lina, can I invite you to quickly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Adi. Very good to be here and absolutely delighted to be part of this incredible conversation, especially on the topic of listening, core to my heart, and I think more important than ever now. I'm here both as a learner and also a fellow explorer on the topic of how listening can help us lead ourselves better and also lead our team better, and hopefully help the community we serve thrive and flourish, especially during this time. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Lina. And I should, of course, remind everyone, Lina, that you've reached pretty much the end of your day in Singapore. I think it's about, remind me, it's what, 10 o'clock?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody will ultra appreciate the commitment from you for joining us so late in the evening. So thank you so much. And thank you for your friendship and support over the years to me personally and to Common Purpose. Monica, over to you. Dr. Monica Keretts-Makau from the Thunderbird School of Management. Do introduce yourself, please, and say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you, Adi and Lina. Great to be on panel with you today. And it's really great to be part of the team of American Leadership Express. Thunderbird has been a partner with American Express for many years now and has run several sessions with American Express. So we are delighted to be part of, this particular conversation around listening. And just like Lina, for me, a journey, I don't think one ever reaches it. And so we'll be reflecting on ourselves, including reflecting on myself. This has been an opportunity to reflect on myself, reflecting on our leadership styles as listeners, and of course, what does it mean for our teams and how to flourish? So looking forward to being part of this conversation together.
Absolutely. I think we're all on a learning journey on this one together, as you both rightly pointed out. And looking forward to our little conversation as we have been having in preparation, but also looking forward to the questions that come. What do we provoke in others and what comes back? So looking forward to the parallel process, as it were. So without further ado, let me kick off with a question to both of you, and I'll jump in as well with my thoughts. Of course, one of the themes of this year's summit, along with Lead, which was yesterday, and Flourish, which is going to be tomorrow, is Listen, which is today. I think we all know how important listening is. We acknowledge it, and I certainly have realized it over the 20-odd years of my career in leadership development. I don't know about you both, Lina and Monica, but I feel listening has often been underrated as being essential to leadership. I wonder what you both think. Do you agree? And if you do, would you share some initial perspectives on the importance of listening in the context of leadership, as you have started to do already when you shared your initial thoughts? So I'm just wondering, Lina, can I invite you in? And then I'll hear from Monica, if that's all right.
I absolutely agree that listening has often been, it's something that's not focused in our training, right? We've been rated for the way we speak. In fact, in classes, we know that students are rated for how often they actually speak and ask questions. So definitely in our training, we've never been taught to listen, to ask questions, and to really ask questions with the purpose of listening. So many of us are being asked to put up our hands to ask questions, but often not listen to the answers that we perhaps do not want to hear. Or we've been trained to ask questions only insofar as to hear the things that we want to hear. So we frame the questions exactly, or hopefully around the ambit that we are prepared to listen to. And so I think the entire pandemic has taught us, how do we now ask questions so that we have the breadth of information to prepare us for the decision that we have to make? Because we know, especially in the social sector, the history no longer gives us an accurate prediction of the future. And the social sector is at the forefront of trying to figure out what will fall out next. And so if we are trained and have been trained to only listen to the answers that we have the courage to hear, then I think we would miss a lot of the nuances and perhaps some of the danger that's coming at us and warning us that we need to basically change direction. And so how do we train ourselves to listen and to really listen with the intent and the desire and the courage to hear what is necessary?
Absolutely.
So
yeah, no, thank you for that, Lina. I feel like I've got quite bad-tempered occasionally in conversations recently when people have said listening is a social, is a soft skill, and I'm like, it's a life skill. Come on, get it. If you haven't already. Thank you for reminding us, Lina, from your perspective and the importance of that. Monica, your thoughts?
Just listening to Lina and, thinking I want to take a different angle because at the same time, listening demands, it gives credence to why we speak because we expect to be listened to. So first thing, we're being listened to right now in an audience, which means to speak requires that there's somebody listening. And that's the first thing. It requires that. And I think the second thing to think about is that listening itself is beyond words. And many times we forget that. I remember, 25 plus years ago in my undergraduate, my first degree was communications. And in class, the first thing we learned on the rules of leadership and communication was that, communicating is what is not spoken. It's also what is not spoken. And a big part of listening is what is not spoken. A big part. Many times we think that we will respond to the listener based on what was said, but it's really based on what we heard, what we saw, the way we perceived it, the way we then took those words from how we listened. So there's more to it than just words. And so, drawing from Lina, yes, it's the questioning. And then there's also the fact that it's more than that. It's all the other cues around it to listen. And how do we do that? And I think the second thing that, thinking about those listening is the fact that it has to be active for us as leaders. You could be present in a room and somebody could assume you're listening just because you're silent, which is not the case, as we know. And so really the activeness, the intentionness of thinking through, how do I listen? What cues do I use to be able to intentionally listen? And yes, we talk about, facial expression, looking into the eyes. We talk about the cliches that we know, but I think as leaders, we know that we've got to go beyond and be the active and use activeness in thinking through, how do I listen and what cues do I need to use in listening? And what does it mean to be actively listening? And so just thinking through listening, the other one that I really want to point out is that if I am then actively listening, then I am also willing to listen to everything. Because
thank you for that, Monica. Yeah. Some really strong perspectives there for both of you in terms of training, training the body, training the mind, conditioning, and that importance of making it beyond words and all the things that goes beyond words. I'm going to move on swiftly to the social sector point that Lina mentioned, because I think that's what brings us here today. We're all united in our purpose to want to make an impact on that sector. We belong to that sector. We care for that sector, and we want to do things to affect change in that sector as that sector. Lina, you mentioned this, and I'm just picking up the thread from your thinking. It is, how important is it for the social sector to chart the path forward, which is the theme for the summit, especially as you again said, post-pandemic? How do you think its leaders should approach listening? What should they do? What should they not do? And to me, which was there in your opening statements, what underpins listening? What lies beneath listening? Thoughts? You want to jump in again, Lina?
As I said in the beginning, I'm a learner in listening. And I think the last 12 months or 18 months of the pandemic have really taught me again and again the key importance of listening. And as Monica said, listening in more than one just through the ears, but listening to the things unsaid. In the medical world, we often teach this, listening to your patient, to the words that are unsaid, but how often do we take this to the boardroom and decision making? Charting the path forward is an interesting thing to think about today, because charting the path forward for me is making the decision each day on what else are changing in front of us. Rachel House is a hospice and is a home-based care. Yeah. And so we enter into the homes of some of the most marginalized communities, crowded spaces, and with children with immunity problems. And that means we need to be aware of both our team safety and also our patient safety. And things are changing by the day, right? We see it in India, we see it before it was the UK, and now it's everywhere else. And so charting the path forward is a day-by-day thing. Every day information is changing. And this is the most important time, I think, as leaders, that we learn that as we come into work every day, things are changing. Things are changing not only on a political front, where a newspaper would actually announce things, but things are changing in the very office, in the very terrain that your team is going into. So if you are, I like to use the wartime scenario. If you're a general in an ivory tower or in your command center, how do you make the decision? You make the decision by knowing your people, first and foremost. And you make the decision by first and foremost knowing how you respond, how you listen, and how your people will respond. And that means that you really need to learn every day the pulse of your people. Because if they're in danger, just one person, it will take the whole platoon down. So how do you listen in more than just one way, not just listening through your ears, but how do you ask questions? How do you see the unseen and the unspoken? And then when you go out to serve, to chart the path forward, so to speak, how do you make sure that you touch the pulse of every single one of your partners, your people on the ground, and the people that you always work with, not only your team, but everyone else? So in the social sector, more than anyone else, any other time, we need to basically spread wide and broadly, but also we need to really go deep in knowing our team that we send out. In order to do all of that, it takes us to be willing to listen to ourselves, to really confront the truth of who we are, what we are, how do we respond, right? What Monica said, how do we listen? What do we listen to? Maybe before we even go there, why do we listen? What inspires us to listen? Because therein lies the desire to listen. That will inspire the desire to listen if we know why. Why do we want to listen? And so in the beginning, when I said, I feel more and more that the reason why I need to listen is so that I can lead myself better, and so that I can be a better leader for myself and for the people I work with, and hopefully for the community that we serve.
No, thank you for that, Lina. You've reminded, I'm sitting here listening to you, I talk to you so much, but always what really comes home with our conversation is the importance of the self. If you're claiming to be a learner, you've got to change a few things around yourself in order to be able to respond better to your environment, even listen better to your environment. Monica, can I invite you and really want to draw on your academic sort of, kind of background, as it were, on how you kind of approach listening, particularly in the context of what underpins it. Lina explained it from her very real context of being a leader in the social sector. From your context, what underpins it?
Thinking through and chatting, my context is that I deal with a lot of partners. Thunderbird is always working with so many countries. 1 minute we're in Russia, 1 minute it's South America, 1 minute it's Australia. And I think listening and chatting the path forward for me starts with, what should I be listening to? What should I be listening to? And that's important. Even with students, I teach mostly adults, and in adult learning and in the boardroom, many of them in boardrooms, and it's, what should we be listening to? That's, for me, an always very important question. And if I ask myself that, it's in the context of whatever it is at the time that I'm dealing with. What should I be listening to? And then what am I not listening to that I should be listening to? And that's a willingness to self-reflect as a leader. Because then you might not be listening to something that you should be listening to. And the only way you will know that is going back to Lina's first beginning statement, asking questions, and the right kind of questions. Now, as a teacher, in Kenya, I call myself, I'm a mwalimu first and foremost. Regardless of my academics, my professorship, or anything, I feel I'm just a teacher. And what is a teacher listens and asks lots of questions, and then seeks to translate that into chunkable bites that's understood.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with, your academic. You could have a PhD and not be a listener, or be a good teacher.
Yeah.
So it's really not, it's more with talking to yourself and saying, what should I listen to, and what in this context, and what should I be listening to? And I think charting the path forward then is ensuring that if my listener is listening, what are they hearing? So this is the second part. What are they hearing? How am I translating what I think into chunkable bites that they hear? And people will hear differently based on different contexts. I recognize, for example, in my own world that I am Black. And maybe someone is just listening to my Blackness. I teach a lot in the Western world. I teach a lot of people from all parts of the world, Asia, America, US, UK. And I'm conscious about that, but I don't let it hinder me. I am, however, conscious that they could be listening to that. And I need to balance and ensure that they are listening to beyond that it's not Monica from Africa. That the conversation is about the context therein, regardless of the place. So, listening is involving those voices and seeing what are the different perceptions. And that's the third part of listening, is recognizing those different perceptions within, especially, in my line of work, that exist, and then being able to say, how do we chart the path forward? And from a business perspective, listening comes back to you, listening to your teams, hearing them out, just, really wanting to understand. And that goes back and draws back to the fact that you've got to be very self-introspective. Like Lina, I think you can't be a great listener if you're not a self-introspective person.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So right. And that's why Lina reminded us of the importance of self, didn't she? There's some lovely questions that are lining up. I can't wait to take them, but I will get through my first initial set of questions to tease a few more things out. And I just love what you just said and brought it back to business. Monica, yesterday, Trabian, I don't know if you guys were on that conversation with Trabian and Stacey. Trabian said something lovely, which is about love is not a business term, it should be. And I want to add to that and say listening should be a business term, if indeed we're looking at it through the lens of business, because all our lived experiences shape listening, and therefore all our lived experiences should be shaping what business does. Fantastic. I'll ask a quick one, I promise, and then we'll move on to the questions that are lining up beautifully in the chat box. And I just, this is a very personal thing because I made a connection, you could say, in preparation for this conversation, but it did made me think. And because it made me think, I want to know what you both think. I was reading a fascinating interview of Riz Ahmed, the British actor who plays the role of a heavy metal drummer, Ruben, in the American drama Sound of Metal. Some of you may know he was just nominated for the Oscar. Unfortunately, didn't win it. Never mind. He was nominated. Great talent. But Ruben in the drama loses his hearing. And Riz, the actor, he talks about how being with the deaf community in preparation for the role taught him what listening really meant. That made me think, Lina and Monica, that are we talking about the need for leaders to consciously do a few things to get better at listening so that they can start to even flourish, because we talked about listening in the context of leadership. And I think listening in the context of flourishing, because Lina reminded us, we're in a pandemic situation. We've got to find a way to get out of it. What do you think, Monica? I'm going to put that one to you first and then hear from Lina. Monica, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Okay. Interesting. I haven't gotten to watch the movie yet, but I'm looking forward to that. I think I know I did, piece a little bit where you're put in a place where you've got to, you can't hear, or you can't see, and, different ways in which we listen. But I think leadership calls for us to put ourselves in spaces that we don't necessarily enjoy being in, or that we may enjoy, but we don't take ourselves there, so that we can listen better. Because when we are used to being in the spaces that we are comfortable with, then we sort of listen in certain ways and we're unable to flourish. And flourishing requires us to put ourselves in different contexts.
Yeah. Out of
It's
our
the way,
comfort zone.
exactly, it's the way you know yourself better. It's the way you discover your team better. It's the way you discover different things about your team. And it's the way you're able to push, the boundary zones of whatever it is in your institution that's, bugging you. For me, listening starts with different things. I'm passionate about nature, as I think you know, Adi and Lina.
Yes.
Probably an addicted person when it comes to plants and trees and stuff. And there's a joy with listening to birds. And if there's a joy. I'd rather be jogging on the side where I can hear the birds than when I can hear the cars. There's a joy of seeing crickets. There's a joy of the sound of nature. And that ability to hear that, I don't take it for granted anymore. And that being in that place and realizing there are other things to listen to. And it makes you reflect and even think about work. The irony is that even in those spaces, you're able to reflect about yourself and think about work. So, in your asking about time and thinking through where are we going and the path forward and what does it mean in terms of active listening, I'd say encourage leaders to put themselves in spaces they're not often in. It could be sports, it could be whatever it is, spaces, people that you're often not with, even people. Including different, look at this team here, amazing different races, amazing different contexts, because you will hear things and begin to internalize and ask yourself different things. And I think for me, being a Thunderbird, that's been one of the greatest things with Dean Sanjeev, is that we're global. And so different contexts, different people, always challenging yourself. It's not enough to be comfortable with your zone.
Which is exactly the point I think Riz was making, putting yourself in the shoes of the people who are really going through that journey. Lina, your thoughts? I know you said training right at the start, but what's your thinking in terms of listening to flourish, and what more do leaders need to do in order to get there? That extra effort. Lina, you're on mute.
I was thinking about dialogue in the dark when you talked about, being among people without hearing. And I was reminded once by Andreas, who founded Dialogue in the Dark, how leaders would use his space to basically do management training. And for entering Dialogue in the Dark, you'll have people without sight guiding you through darkness and to this place where you would be given a baton, and only when you have the baton can you speak. And otherwise, you have to listen. And before you speak, you have to repeat what the other speaker had actually said completely and summarized it. Otherwise, you won't be able to speak. And I think that really teaches one, because I've used that same skills or technique now when there are difficult conversations to be had with the team. And I think that really teaches us to actually listen. The other part also is meditation, or walking in nature. It's in that silence that we often hear what we don't hear, and I think for me that's the key to beginning to learn how to listen.
It's really interesting. Kim Washington, DC, I think you both have kind of touched upon it, but just in case you want to add anything to that, she asks a very interesting question about that, which was part of my question, but I knew you'd say it anyway. Practical tips on how to better listen, especially, and I think her point is really well made, when you're constantly overwhelmed with your work, personal, home stuff. So there's other noises around you, I suppose. How do you then listen better? You've said meditation, Lina. You've talked about doing a few things to, listen, being close to nature, etc. Are there any other practical things that you might want to jump in on? Yes, Monica?
I think, one of the ways to do that is to consciously to set aside time.
Mm-hmm.
Just being practical, just, to set aside time. With the noise, you can put it at the back burner and set aside time. And setting aside time in a technological world is becoming hard, but it's important to set aside time to say, I need to focus on this issue. It's not going to be about my phone. It's not going to be about social media. It's not going to be about the number of emails coming in, and if it's the emails that are coming in, to set aside time and say what must be done fast. And it's the simple anecdote of setting aside time and then intentionally then focusing on it. I'm reading an interesting book on changing your habits, and interesting stuff around the fact that habits, you can either change them from the outcome or from the inner person. And it's the inner person that you want to focus on. And I think just to comment and say, one of the ways to consciously do it is really look at the inner person and say, how am I doing that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's so interesting. I feel when I stop to do one thing better, I start to notice other things around me. My other faculties go up. I can never get it right. I can never win. I'm sure that's not true for both of you. I'm sure you were much more disciplined in your approach. Lina, anything you want to say on the practical side?
This is something that in healthcare, especially now, that people are asking the same question. With so much being thrown at us, how do we focus?
Yeah.
And so much information daily. Or if you're working in emergency room, how do I cope? Or if you're going into people's homes where there are constant challenges with, families being ill and everyone else, how do you focus? And I think we have this amazing breath that we come back to. Just take one breath and suddenly the silence is there. And if you just, because sometimes there is nothing else to hang on to, and you can only hang on to one thing, and that's your breath. And somehow when you take that deep breath, you have that momentary awareness of what to focus on. And then everything is okay for that moment. There is wisdom in our breath. And I remember listening to the speaker yesterday talking about inspire. It's breath and spirit.
Aspire, yeah, that's right.
And it is breath and spirit. And breath connects you to your spirit. Right?
Absolutely.
And that therein lies that whole moment where you have that wisdom.
Absolutely. Well, I thought I teased out the practical stuff, but I think Kim's question, sort of took us a bit deeper into this. And I need to think about some of the things both of you thought about, because I've got to put my hands up and say that clearly is not my strength, but I'm aware of it. The next question is an interesting one, and I'm linking it because I clearly see one. And, again, I'm sure you'll give us your perspective on it. Bao from Zambia asks, what would you say is the hardest thing about listening to many voices, which you've kind of talked about, while being aware of the value of our own voice as well as leaders? Because I think in some cultures, I feel that, for good or for bad, we drown our own voices as well, and that is not great either. So would you agree that it's the hardest thing about listening to many while you're also appreciating the value of your own voice as leaders? Lina?
Monica, go.
You go. I think she says, yeah, okay.
I'm happy to go if you want, but you go, Lina, first.
I think as a woman especially, we, especially, I mean, in my culture, I grew up where men has more presence. My brothers, I'm the youngest, but my brothers, even if they're just like, 10 months or 11 months older than me, they definitely had a lot more stature in my father's eye. And so that habit is a difficult one for me to break. And so I think listening to many voices while reckoning your own wisdom takes training, for me at least. Takes recognizing first who that voice is, and really acknowledging the wisdom of that voice. Today, especially when there's so many fake news,
Mm.
we are being asked again and again to come back to really recognize that voice, come back to listen, because within us, the wisdom is there. We don't have to complain about fake news because within us, the
Of what's right and
intuition is
wrong. Yeah.
intuition of our own wisdom.
Yeah.
And so we are in this time where we're being asked again and again to come back, learn that voice, learn to get friendly and to understand that voice is our guide. And so I think it's the most important time for us to really value the inner wisdom, the inner leader, and while being able to still move in this world and listen to the many voices outside.
I remember someone said to me, I know, Monica, you're waiting to bring you in. I remember someone said to me, I almost don't do that listening, valuing my own voice, because I find it very hard to reconcile with it and have the difficult conversations. I think those are the big moments of change, isn't it? When you force yourself to do that. Absolutely. Monica, my apologies. I know you were going to come in, so please.
No, I wanted Lina to speak first, so that's great.
Thank
Just
you.
listening to Lina, and we share the same culture where men's voices tend to be the ones that are heard first. And we've just had in Kenya, nominated for our first female Chief Justice. What an exciting time in the country to have a first female Chief Justice. And yet that voice of her voice and the voice of women, many people would question it and asking questions, why should we have one? Why are we celebrating it? But just to go back to the question, in terms of the hardest thing about listening to many voices, and I think the hardest thing about listening to many voices is being clear first, and then while knowing your voice as a leader, is being clear for what it is that you're seeking out as a leader. Because if you're not clear, you're going to listen to everything. And yes, you will listen, but you don't have the time as a leader to listen to everything. Yet you need to balance it. And it's the same, it's almost the same nuances as knowing what to say, when to say, and how to say. It's the same nuance with listening. So the hardest thing about listening to many voices is ensuring that you're listening to so many diversity of perspectives that might not be taking you anywhere at the same time. Yet you need to hear them. And then recognizing your own voice in the process. And I think the second hardest thing is your own perceptions about thinking that you might be right when you're not. And so you don't want to listen to another, you don't want to listen to another voice because you're so fixated as a leader on your position of where we're going. And yet you need to hear other people critique that very voice. So I think, and when you are given a position of a voice as a leader, I think it's that privilege of knowing when to use it, how to use it, and what to say when using it. So the when, the how, because it's not necessarily the right time to say. So it's knowing that balance of using it. And I think that calls us to a reasoning many times as a leader, to step back and say, is this the right time? Should I be listening more? Wait here.
Sometimes it's in self-preservation without people realizing it, isn't it? Isn't it, Monica? Yeah. I'm gonna take the question from Kyle from Milwaukee, who asks, because this is very much about technique, and Monica, you may want to come in, because you've got that kind of rigor in thinking and practice, I know, in your day-to-day. Would you consider surveys, let's say, an effective way to help stakeholders feel heard, or why not? Because I think when we are talking about how can the social sector as such and leaders within the sector feel better, that's a really practical question that I think we need to give Kyle a bit of a steer on. Monica, would you want to come in on that?
When you do surveys, just today, someone from Geneva sent me an email asking me about some surveys and whether I could do them. And my challenge with I think surveys are great, especially, in the social sector, yes, but it's important that we know the target audience for that survey. There's no point of just making, we don't want the tick box. So I want to assume that the survey is not being done for a tick box. So if it's not being done for the tick box and it's being done with intention, then the intention will make the survey great or not. So the issue is not the survey. The issue is to what extent am I intentionally ensuring that my survey is getting to the person that I need to pick the information from. But remember, as with a survey, many times it's, quantitative or qualitative. And so necessarily you're not hearing the voice, you're not seeing the emotion. And in the social sector, part of the work in development is hearing the voice, seeing the emotion, seeing the feeling, seeing the angst. And those you don't see in a survey. You don't see in a survey. And so there is danger at the same time. And so I am not saying yes and I'm not saying no.
No,
I'm saying
either.
be aware of the dangers and therefore asking yourself, what is it really I'm using the survey for? Is it allowing me to really listen and hear? Or am I only hearing one part, which is the tick box, and not seeing the angst and the anxiety and the people's feelings and emotions? And I'm not able to be empathetic. Because you want to draw that out from your survey. How do you make decisions in the social sector a lot with surveys, but you need to be careful that those decisions are not generalized, that they miss the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Lina, I'm going to jump and ask you one on the community, because Yojun from Japan is up very late at night, I gather, and I feel deserves an answer. No one better than you on this one, where it's about listening to the community. I think Yojun feels that people feel they have a lot in common, but everyone has a different perspective in the community. Any tips to deal with that? How people are quite different in a community context? And I know this is your day-to-day, Lina. This is what keeps you awake at night. So final thoughts on this one, and then we'd wrap up.
I think in a similar strain as survey, right? And what we said earlier when we started, asking the question of why do we listen? What inspires us to listen? And in a community, if you feel that there's a lot of assumption, and I used to be told that assumption makes a fool out of you and me, right? Make an ass out of you and me. But we all do it. And we often shape and frame the question in order to get the answer that we want to hear. And how do we become aware of that within ourselves? How do we become aware of the fact that we ourselves make the assumption that everyone is similar, that everyone is the same? That when we create a decision or we make a decision, we assume that community will like this solution. I think it's being able to call out without blaming that we are making assumption, like time out, we are doing the very thing that we say we won't. And that sort of ability to call each other out needs a place of safety for everyone to work within, and a common goal. Understanding first and foremost in the social sector, we are serving a community. And so there's no right or wrong. There's just one goal. We're driving the community forward so that everyone can benefit. So if everyone has to flourish, and the goal is for us being here is so that everyone flourish, then surely it's all right for us to call out when we are making assumptions and we are doing a survey that may not actually deliver the answer that benefits the community. So how do we come back to the purpose of why we're here?
Yeah, absolutely. What's this all about? What
Exactly.
are we trying to achieve? Absolutely. Yeah. You mentioned time. Time was always going to be against us, particularly given our track record, the three of us come together to have this conversation. We've ignored time gladly. Unfortunately, we can't do it today simply because there's a plan and we need to rapidly move on. But Monica, can I invite you to just kind of closing comments from you? What would you want our audience, particularly for me, as I'm quite obsessed about this, leaders of the social sector who are alumni of these programs to leave with, and when it comes to lead, listen, and flourish?
And maybe my closing remarks are going to be contextual. 2021 in the world is COVID, has had COVID. It's the first time we're having this, all of us experiencing it. And I think it would be unjust for me not to say to the social sector that we must listen being aware that we're in a pandemic, how do we listen?
Hmm.
What are we listening to?
Yeah.
Yesterday I joined a chat, and some people were talking about the vaccine and the vaccine they were having, and I almost thought that was very unthoughtful, because there are many people in the audience that didn't have a vaccine. And so very, very, and very unfair that someone else is talking about, they've had their jabs and everything, and there's another group here that completely hasn't had any, jabs. And I think in the social sector, to be very aware of what people are feeling, so that we can listen better, especially going forward, and then beyond the pandemic, because we're flourishing, and beyond that, really being conscious about the fact that if I want to listen as a leader, then I need to be very self-reflective on myself. I need to be willing to ask, what am I listening to? Am I listening? How do I listen? What are my body cues on listening? What are my challenges with listening? Before I even go there, that I need to look at myself. And the more you look at yourself, the easier it is to listen to others. I don't know where the science comes in, but I think it
does. It does.
Yeah, it does. And so I think my parting shots are, let's listen to ourselves so that we can be better leaders out there. Otherwise, many times as leaders, we don't think about ourselves, we think about others. And in the social sector, your focus is so much on others that you forget yourself. And I want to remind those here in the audience, don't forget yourself even as you lead others.
Brilliant. Thank you, Monica. Lina, final thoughts from you before I close the session.
I think, thank you, Monica. I'm learning such a lot. We talk about what do we listen, how do we listen, why do we listen? Because somebody reminded me a long time ago that when we speak, we're only hearing from ourselves what we already know. And so how do we learn more? How do we gain knowledge? The only way is to actually listen. And so how do we listen with a desire to learn? And how do we learn to find out why is it important for me today to listen? And how do we listen so that we have the courage to make decisions? And that means listening with the breath beyond what we feel we're prepared and ready for, and framing our question in such a way that it will take us beyond that boundaries. And today, more than any other time, we need to stretch.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Lina, Monica. Gosh, I can't thank you both. It's been such a privilege for me to kind of host this conversation with you both, taking so much away. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you for Lina and Monica for inspiring us. And also thank you massively for the insightful questions that came. Huge thank you to American Express, obviously, for the support of this conversation. We've come together in a great way, the three of us, and have learned a lot by just listening to each other and how the three of us have approached it. And of course, thank you to American Express indeed for the entire summit. Remember, join us again tomorrow at the same time, which is 10 a.m. Eastern Time, for the final conversation on Flourish, which will be with Greta Rios, President and founder of Olin, Margianta Suraman, founder and executive director of Emancipate Indonesia, and Terry Broussard-Williams, author of Find Your Fire. I invite the alumni and attendees who are attending the full summit to take a break after this and then return at the top of the hour for the next workshop. Now, but before we leave you, I'm going to, the invitation from the organizers is to leave you with a special video from the Leader Stories that highlights one of the dynamic members of our community. And this video footage, I must mention, was captured before 2020. Once again, a massive thank you to Lina and Monica for engaging in this conversation. Massive thank you to Atlas Core and to American Express for hosting this conversation. It gives me immense pleasure to have been a part of it. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a fantastic day, evening, night, whichever part of the world you're in. Thank you.
In Lakota society, we're really taught that everybody's a leader and that everybody has, the opportunity to help their people. When I began to tell my story of my own childhood, of growing up in a very rural area, a place that was very poverty-stricken, I felt really empowered to be able to use that storytelling as a way to transform hearts. Our organization, Native Americans in Philanthropy, has been focusing on advocacy to level out the playing field for Native Americans. For me, part of that is working in unconventional ways. We brought 1,000 women to the Women's March to educate and advocate on behalf of access to health care, violence against the earth, violence against women, and education. So it was really a sacred experience.
In recognition of her commitment and outstanding leadership, I would like to present Sarah with this award.
Anybody can do this work. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter, your socioeconomic status. Making change is hard. But if I can tell this story that's a transformative story that can really get to somebody's heart and can push them to impact, to make change, then that's what I want to do.